poor girl. That doesn't bother me at all.
Welcome to American Beauty, Episode 5, Part 3, a conversation about debt. Before we get started, I want to thank our cross-promotional sponsors, Closing the Women's Wealth Gap, which is an initiative backed by a network of 250 professionals and researchers in finance focused on closing the wealth gap for women of color and low-income women. So thank you very much. Big shout out. Check out their website, closingthewomenswealthgap.org. And thanks to everyone who's sharing these episodes with their friends. This one especially. So many people carry such a great deal of shame around debt, and it's time to really open this conversation. So I hope you'll be that person. And we have with us alias Nicole and Professor who now has her, who's just started her first professional postdoctoral fellowship job, still in New York City. How you doing, Nicole?
Mm-hmm. Doing well. How are you, Joanna?
I am good. And we have also Professor Lynn Itagaki, who is a member of the English department faculty at the University of Missouri, but is currently a visiting fellow at Northumbria University in England. Hi, Lynn. How are you?
Hi, Joanna. Thanks for having me.
So, I was thinking, perhaps coincidentally, yesterday I met with someone who helps me take care of my own financial planning, and we were talking about the cost of college. My kids are almost 15 and almost 13, and I have a solid job and I have a lot of privilege, and holy moly, that was not a good conversation, and I've been careful. I love my financial planner. She's a very pragmatic feminist woman of color, and we were just really breaking it down. And in terms of the way, Lynn, you've spoken about debt, the way, Nicole, we've been able to talk about debt, just that there is an issue here about the affordability of what used to pass for a middle-class life that is just not on the political radar in the way it should be. And so I was wondering this morning to myself, what would it look like if the amount of consumer debt people carried was one of those leading economic indicators we hear all the time? What would that do to our financial conversation or our political conversation? Can you imagine, Lynn?
Well, I could see it from the perspective of captains of our financial industry, in that they would say that it isn't high enough, right? Because they can repackage the debt and create more profits and generate a higher GDP in which money increases money, right?
Huh.
So that's on one hand. But I think the other question that you're asking is really for us to return to what college is for, and what it has reliably meant for the middle class, right? And upward mobility and achieving a kind of security that is fast evaporating for the 99%, I would say. I mean, I was just reading an article about how college has become it should be thought of as a finishing school for elites, because that is who can afford it, and that is the culture, that it is becoming increasingly inaccessible as a culture to students who are not from these elite conversations, cultures, lifestyles, and that when students who don't vacation regularly in exotic locales or go to expensive private schools, right? That the kinds of conversations that people are having on a regular basis in dorms or in socialization at college spaces are actually increasingly out of reach for the working class, as well as for the maybe lower middle class.
And that becoming out of reach, that's not any fault of the people. I mean, one of the things that struck me, that if we had a leading economic indicator, how much consumer debt is being carried, it could be mapped against the divestment of federal, state, local governments in public goods like education, in healthcare, even in infrastructure. I mean, the redirection of our shared resources away from the common good means that we all have to take this on. And because our narrative hasn't caught up, because we don't talk about that enough, it's all private, it's all hidden. I mean, Nicole, is your which led me to think, Nicole, about the stack of bills you were keeping in your closet when we talked. I mean, since we talked, has it gotten any easier for you to think about your debt, to deal with your debt? Are the debt collectors still calling every day?
Oh yeah, they're still calling. Yeah, I mean, I think that the actual, like, the financial burden, the very practical burden is obviously like the primary conversation and the most kind of salient thing to be discussed and handled. But the emotional, psychological burden that comes with debt is something that I don't think we're discussing nearly enough. And I think that the point that Lynn raised about, who is college for and who has access to it, and is the debt to, the debt ratio to what you get out of it and how much you can, become upwardly mobile, that may be something that we need to start assessing, and, New York City, both Columbia University Medical School and NYU Medical School just removed tuition from medical school. And they were able to do that from very generous donors. And they've now potentially changed the landscape of what the student population could look like over the next 20 years.
Wow.
And I think that that's really significant. So we could say, like, maybe people will need to evaluate whether or not they can go to school, or maybe we could say and ask the question and start holding these institutions' feet to the fire and saying, what are you doing to make this education possible? Because really, you don't have the best of the best. You have the best of who can afford it. So you're limiting the potential to find that best potential doctor or researcher or whoever in whatever field, because it's not accessible. And so I think the question should be put back onto these institutions and these systems to make themselves more available and accessible to potential students with talent who want to learn and grow.
Right. And I love what you said too, thinking about the emotional and cultural weight of debt that isn't talked about. It's going to take some outing of that. It's going to take some talking about that to gather the political will to hold institutions accountable, you think? I mean, Lynn, are there any stories we're seeing, right? You're an English professor. Are there any cultural narratives we're seeing where that is materializing in movies, in books, where people are really manifesting what it feels like to be at this point in American history where, the failures of the promises or the limits of the promises are very clear?
Well, I think that the legacy of the Great Recession has not been forgotten, but I think the political will has evaporated in the sense that, the Occupy movement has sort of lost its national and international steam. However, it's still lingering and still relevant in terms of the Black Lives Matter movements that are really around the world. So the political will in some ways that are specifically tied to making sure that financialization works for the 99%, I think has lost a kind of impetus that it had. Currency, exactly. But I think it's a long-standing problem. I mean, when I was in grad school, albeit, many years ago, I remember as president of our English group, our student group, that I really wanted to have a conversation about finances because I thought that would be important, going forward. Is that, like, we all are carrying debt of some kind, and if not, we are a drain on our extended networks. So how is it that we're managing it? And it got no traction whatsoever because I think similarly to the way people view therapy, that it's a private encounter. What you and your FAFSA form have to say is entirely a private matter that should not be discussed in public. So it's going back into that kind of shame spiral, and then also that is related to debt. I would also say that when I was lobbying the California legislature, which has its progressive tendencies, it's known nationally. When I was lobbying in the 90s, the legislators were uninterested because they thought that University of California institution at $2,000 a semester, a quarter, so that would be 6,000 a year, was too cheap, that it was too inexpensive, and that if they raised tuition or registration fees, that that was on par with what was going on in education, not thinking. And so this comes back to the political will, right? Is that we are consistently electing people to political office, whether it's in our state legislatures, whether it's in our Congress, who seem to think that education is something that should be expensive, that it shouldn't be affordable, and that people should take on all this debt because of the benefits will vastly outweigh the cost of that debt. Obviously, they're not reading the recent studies and literature that shows how college debt, student loans are making sure that generations upon generations are suffering from the lack of wealth. This intergenerational wealth that you can pass on to your children.
It corrodes capital. I mean, like we've talked about, anytime that someone is paying so much of their income as a fledgling professional to pay down debt, that's money they're not saving for investment in what's next. And that has to come back at some point to erode, right, the middle class, which is the story we know. But going back, I'm fascinated by listening to you talk about lobbying the California legislature, and legislators thinking education was too cheap at the UC. Was there a value proposition there of what would happen if tuition went up, that people would value education more, or what was their logic?
I think they were just comparing it with private institutions like Stanford or University of Southern California and saying, wow, it's a great deal. Not thinking back to why it was such a great deal, right? That there are people for which $2,000 a quarter and $6,000 a year, it means eating ramen noodles, 3 times a day, and for them, they are purely seeing it in these kind of relative terms of, well, they or their own personal experience in which they have no debt from college because they were able to tap the wealth of their families.
And going back, to Nicole's point about holding institutions accountable, our colleague Chris Newfield at University of California, Santa Barbara, in his book on the defunding of public education in California, he holds administrators responsible. I mean, he recalls sitting in some of those hearings and watching, university administrators not make the aggressive case for affordable education, saying, oh, yeah, we're sorry. Of course, we can't take from another person's share of the pie. I still can't figure out why university administrators in public university systems everywhere don't buy billboards that show how $1 invested in public education yields, X economic return in terms of the development of the citizens of a state and industry and intellectual capital. I mean, there has been a real asleep at the wheel, a real reticence to compete. And some of those people have had debt. I mean, I look around and some of our administrators do come from diverse backgrounds and don't have intergenerational wealth. I just wonder what will light the fire. Nicole, what do you think? Like, what will light the fire?
I do see like a generational gap in between, kind of the boomers and then I don't know, the generation right after that in between millennials and boomers and
Gen X. We are Gen X.
Gen X, right? So typically, I think what happens with most social movements is that the culture changes, and then about a decade, after that, policy tends to follow. And so, and we can kind of look at that at different kind of social movements throughout time. And what I know, as far as just the conversations that I hear among kind of millennials that are kind of in my social circles is, millennials don't really enjoy the show Friends, talking about, cultural narratives, like, because Friends never account for why do these young people have all of this money and live in a mansion in Manhattan? How did this happen, right? And so shows that are on right now that are quite popular are starting to have more accurate portrayals of what life is like when you're a young professional just starting out. Shows like Girls and Insecure, and those shows show kind of that grit and that struggle of like driving a crummy car that doesn't work and talking about debt and the things that you cut out of your life to be able to pay this or that bill. It's interesting. I was having a conversation with someone of Generation X, and they said, well, now you're getting your first job with like good money, and like that'll be great. Like, are you gonna move out of where you are now and get a better apartment? And I said, are you kidding me? I said, the only thing more money means for me is that my student loan payment will go up.
Right.
My lifestyle doesn't change at all. And I don't know at what point the shift happens with the finances. I don't know where that is. But so it's just really interesting that there's this generational gap. And I do think that millennials are feeling the brunt of it, the weight of it. But we're also talking about it, I think, a little bit more. And that is starting to shift because it is, and I'm not, an expert on media, nor do I consume a lot of kind of mass media, but it seems in the things that I have, seen or the conversations that I've heard, that is starting to be a shift of more transparency and openness and having the discussion and the dialogue.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think, Lynn? I mean, you're Gen X kind of like me, I think. So what do you see happening in culture?
Having grown up on Friends.
Yeah, which was ridiculous. It was ridiculous back in the day. I never found it watchable. Sidebar.
Absolutely. Well, the Gellers inherit that apartment from their nana or their grandmother.
Ah.
So I'm not sure if they inherit the apartment entirely or if they inherit her rent control. Right. But either way, they benefit from her legacy, her wealth legacy, right?
And that's a racial privilege legacy. That's a white privilege legacy.
Absolutely. Yes. And, you were talking, Nicole, about, now you have a job that pays well. You live in New York City, right? Most expensive city. It's eclipsed by San Francisco, but one of the most expensive cities, right? So a lot of what's going on, what in your budget's going toward just, basic needs, shelter and food, right? And transportation. And I mean, if we think about something called unmanageable debt, it's just 8% of one's income. However, we know that 8% does a lot of damage, right? I mean, that pretty much sucks away any kind of savings, any kind of
cushion,
future retirement benefits, that kind of thing, or saving for college. Joanna, you were mentioning earlier, right? For yourself, for your family, right? And for African American students and for Latino students, according to the State's Public Interest Research Group, their higher education project, 55% of African Americans and 58 Latinx students have unmanageable debt, compared to 39% of students on average. So unmanageable debt, again, 8% of the budget, which, some people on the street would be like, oh, well, 8% is kind of like a state tax or something. But no, right? I mean, we know how it just completely erodes our ability to kind of save for emergencies or something like that. And that is what students of color are facing when it comes to student loans. And, I mean, I just want to keep talking about these kinds of facts and figures. I put it in my classes in women's studies and in English to kind of show that, the income gap for women and men or for different racial groups might close, but because the wealth gap is so severe, right? African Americans have kind of recovered from Great Recession, 8% of the white households' wealth, right? And then women, it's 32%, and that's all women. We're not disambiguating among different racial groups, but they're like so small. in this, and then on top of that, the student loans. So, to keep telling the generations of students that I have contact with, right, that these kinds of things are crucial. The kind of middle class dream is slipping out of reach because we're allowing our policymakers to be unaccountable. They're unaccountable for the way in which student loan officers at each institution received, I don't know, they received basketball tickets, courtside tickets, they received bottles of tequila, premium tequila, right? They received all these perks from student loan servicers, private student loan servicers, and so that these private loan companies could go at the top of the list that were handed out to students because most students chose the first two. And where are these student loan officers now? They're still working. They've never faced charges, despite bilking students out of untold hundreds of millions of dollars over the lifetime of their loans.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, it leaves me, when I start connecting the dots and just sort of, Karen Salt wasn't able to come back on today, but, the story she tells about Haiti and the history of Haiti, and most people don't realize that, Haiti had to buy its way to freedom and go into enormous debt to do so. So it in modern economies, it almost sounds like debt is an enabling condition for any kind of mobility. And just to be alive, just to be nominally free is to be in debt for people of color. Like that's just seems like the story of modernity, that there's no way out of it. I mean, there were maybe a couple decades, when people were able to gain a little ground, but the vast majority of our history has been the majority of citizens enthralled. And that's just not a story we think of when we think about, America. But that's the truth. I'm getting impatient for that story to break through because until then, everyone manages the dissonance between the stories they are told and the stories they are living in pretty, damaging ways, I think. They either feel guilty or healthy ways, they don't care. They realize the futility of it. So closing out, Lynn, this is your opportunity to give advice to actual people like Nicole, who are brilliant and hardworking people of color and, who are doing everything right. How would you tell folks to think about the debt they carry?
I think it's less about their telling me. It's about my telling them, but more they're telling me, and they're telling other people like myself and other voters, right? That we have to hold people accountable for the financial crimes that they've done, for the white collar crimes that they've perpetrated against generations of students, right? Students who are hardworking and who believe in the American dream and believe in mobility and are doing everything that they were told that they should do, and they are being preyed upon. While you were talking about Karen Salt's work and about the situation in Haiti, I'm reminded over and over again of Patricia Williams' comments about the Emancipation Proclamation wasn't about freedom, it was about being unenslaved.
Yep.
So what is that condition of being unenslaved, right? So this debt peonage, debt bondage, all of this, it is not freedom, right? It is about being unenslaved, but now free to be preyed upon by, unscrupulous landlords in terms of the sharecropping situation that occurred in the South immediately after, or in terms of, just the chain gangs that you have Michelle Alexander talking about in the New Jim Crow, right? And this history and abolition studies, right? So unenslavement, what does that mean? It means that we are free now to be preyed upon.
Dang. And Nicole, if you were to tell the truth, I think Lynn, Professor Itagaki is right. It's not about what professors can tell citizens. It's about what people who have the power to amplify voices can reflect from the people who are living this. So, from your perspective, what would you tell other folks in your shoes?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, one is start, working on the shame aspect of it.
Yeah.
And start having conversations and talking and processing. Because we talk and we process with, whether it's in a therapeutic setting or just with friends and family, like we talk about all sorts of things. We process all sorts of traumas. And this is one that isn't going away anytime soon, and that we're carrying, and that we're carrying both individually currently, but we're also carrying generationally.
Yep.
And yeah, it is not it's not a light truth to think about what the history is of Black bodies having to buy their way out of enslavement, and how that ties into where we are currently with our finances. So I think all of that generational trauma is also held in our bodies. Yep. And in our psyche, and we've got to start talking about it. And that's not going to necessarily change policy right away, but again, shifting the culture in the way that we see it, and seeing this white collar crime, seeing that crime as violent, yep. Right? In the ways that we see Black and brown men in particular as violent, I think would do a lot if we could start to shift the conversation to like, what is actual violence, and who are the perpetrators, and who are the criminals here, and then again, start holding them accountable to be able to have folks fix the mess that they've created.
That is a very powerful observation. I think we should close on it that, what is criminal? What is violence? Is depriving, first of all, is enslaving humans criminal? That's never been adequately addressed. And then forcing folks to buy their way out and borrow to do it, and then profiting off of that. Okay, yeah, but the way that violence is done to families, and that violence and trauma lives in bodies, and the pressure that people of color carry because they have no cushion, that causes the weathering that public health experts have told us contributes to higher rates of mortality, higher rates of infant mortality and mother mortality, higher rates of high blood pressure. So yeah, that would be a powerful story to start telling, to start imagining and connecting those dots. And thank you both for helping me do it. You certainly helped me see more clearly. So, all right. But do not be daunted, Nicole. You will continue to live with joy. I know you will. And hey, thank you.
I'm on my way to eat some avocado toast.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Make it the fancy kind, and get the fancy latte to go with it. And thank you, Professor Itagaki. Thank you, Lynn, so much
Thanks
for your work.
Thanks for hosting the conversation.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. All right, thank you, guys.